When storms tested a palace of glass, some hotels rise from stone, others from steel. But this one, this shimmering palace of glass built on the edge of a vast northern lake, rose from an illusion. By day, it looked weightless, reflecting sky and water until it became impossible to tell where architecture ended and nature began. By night, it glowed like a lantern drifting above the earth. It was breathtaking and impossibly fragile. The vision began with a daring idea: to create a sanctuary made almost entirely of transparent surfaces, a place where guests would feel suspended inside the landscape itself. Walls would vanish into the horizon. Ceilings would mirror the aurora. Light would flow through every corridor, uninterrupted and alive. To understand why this palace matters today, we must return to the moment the creators first stood at the lake's frozen edge. The silence was so complete it felt sacred. The air was sharp, crystalline, and the water beneath the ice carried the kind of stillness that hides unimaginable power. The team believed they could build something that honored that silence, a structure as delicate and fleeting as a reflection. The early design sketches embraced this dream. Thin glass walls shaped to catch the colors of dawn, elevated walkways suspended above water, suites arranged like floating chambers, their floors transparent enough for guests to watch fish glide in the depth below. It was the kind of concept that ignited wonder and raised every imaginable engineering concern. The lake's climate was unforgiving. Winters brought storms that could twist metal. Summers expanded every surface. Temperature swings shattered early prototypes. Glass that looked perfect in controlled environments cracked instantly when tested against winds that roared down from the northern mountains. Still, the vision held. The team believed that if they could master the balance of transparency and strength, they could create a masterpiece unlike anything in the world. A palace made not to dominate nature, but to reveal it. Their first breakthrough came with a specialized layering technique. 3 types of glass fused together to form panels that could flex instead of break. When sunlight touched them, they shimmered like ice crystals suspended in air. It felt like magic, but magic never arrives without a cost. The framing system struggled under the panel's shifting weight. Support beams bowed, anchors loosened. Even the foundations beneath the shoreline behaved unpredictably, settling in ways that distorted the precise angles required to maintain the palace's illusions. Each correction introduced new problems. The team found themselves locked in an intricate dance between beauty and structural survival. Then came the warning sign no one expected. During a routine evening inspection, a quiet tremor rippled across the lake's surface. The ice did not crack. The wind did not rise. But the glass walls vibrated with a low, haunting hum, as if the landscape had whispered a secret through them. The team dismissed it at first. A coincidence, a temperature shift, a harmless anomaly. But the land was speaking. And soon, the storms that defined this northern world would rise, ready to challenge the palace of glass in a way that no blueprint, no simulation, and no dream had prepared them for. The tremor across the glass lingered in everyone's memory, even as they tried to move forward. But the true test began days later, when the first storm of the season swept toward the lake. Forecasts predicted moderate winds, nothing unusual for the region. Still, the team watched the horizon with unease, remembering the strange vibration that had slipped through the palace's skeletal frame like a warning. By late afternoon, the lake changed. The still surface fractured into restless patterns, as if stirred by an unseen hand. The wind grew sharper, gathering speed as it raced across the frozen plains. The glass panels, so clear and serene in calm weather, now reflected the darkening sky with a trembling shimmer. As the storm approached, the palace sang, not a melody, a resonance, a low, wavering tone that traveled through the unfinished halls. Workers paused mid-stride. Engineers exchanged uneasy glances. The layered glass was designed to flex, but not to voice the wind. Something was happening inside the structure, something no simulation had predicted. When the storm finally struck, it came with sudden, startling force. Wind slammed against the glass walls, rolling across the surfaces like invisible waves. The panels bowed inward, then outward, absorbing the pressure just as intended. But the frames holding them, delicate, elegant, minimal, trembled under the continual assault. Bolts held, but only just. Anchors groaned, their strain echoing through metal like distant thunder. Inside the temporary control room, alarms blinked erratically. Sensors tracking panel curvature and pressure distribution spiked into red zones, then dipped, then spiked again. The palace wasn't failing, but it was struggling. And then the lake awoke. A series of deep vibrations rippled through the ice, startling the team. The storm's force was transferring into water, stirring currents beneath the frozen surface. Those currents pressed upward, sending slow, rhythmic pulses through the walkways that extended over the lake. Panels quivered, joints shifted. The entire palace seemed caught between two opposing forces, the wind above and the rising pressure below. Engineers scrambled to interpret the data. Some urged evacuation. Others insisted the palace could endure. But even as they argued, the structure spoke again, a long, resonant hum that vibrated through glass, frame, and floor. It wasn't the wind alone. It wasn't the water alone. It was both, colliding in unpredictable harmony. The conflict deepened with every gust. Walkways twisted just enough to disrupt the underlying support geometry. Panels began reflecting the storm in warped shapes, turning the once beautiful transparency into a prism of fractured light. The palace felt alive, but distressed. A fragile creature pushed past its limits. Then a sharp crack split the air. A single panel, stretched beyond threshold, fractured into a web of shimmering lines. It did not shatter. The layering prevented that. But the message was unmistakable. The palace could not withstand another storm like this. When the winds finally calmed near dawn, the damage became clear. Several panels were compromised. Frames had bent. Foundations near the waterline had shifted dangerously close to failure. The storm had spared the structure, but only barely. Fear settled over the team. Their vision had not been destroyed, but it had been exposed. The palace of glass was beautiful, yes, breathtaking even, but its fragility had become undeniable. They couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The storms of this land were not obstacles. They were part of its identity. And the palace, if it were to survive, would need to change, not by resisting the storms, but by learning how to stand with them. The morning after the storm, the lake lay still again, but the palace of glass did not. It bore the quiet aftermath of a battle it was never truly prepared for. Cracks laced across several panels in delicate but dangerous patterns. Frames leaned at angles no one had authorized. The walkway over the lake listed subtly, as if bowing under the weight of a truth the team had tried not to face. The emotional strain inside the project intensified. Engineers gathered around scans and data reports, their voices low and tense. Designers hovered nearby, silent, watching as their elegant vision warped under the burden of reality. The creators had dreamed of transparency, lightness, and serenity, but the storm had revealed a vulnerability so profound it shook their confidence. For many, doubt took root. Could a building made of glass truly survive in a land sculpted by wind and ice? Could beauty engineered to feel weightless ever withstand forces that had shaped mountains? Was this palace an act of innovation or an act of arrogance? These questions shadowed every discussion. As inspections continued, the team uncovered a pattern that deepened the conflict. The damage was not random. The panels closest to the lake had flexed beyond predictions because the temperature difference between the water and the storm winds had created an intense pressure gradient. The palace had been caught between two climates at once, a battle no model had accounted for. The very feature that made the palace extraordinary, its position over shifting water, was also the source of its fragility. Tensions erupted. Some engineers insisted the design was fundamentally flawed. They argued for thicker panels, heavier frames, more anchors, more reinforcement. But these suggestions threatened the core spirit of the project, the lightweight delicacy that allowed the palace to dissolve into the landscape. Designers resisted fiercely. They believed the palace was meant to be transparent, not only in form, but in feeling. Too much reinforcement would turn it into another fortress of steel pretending to be light. That wasn't the dream. But holding onto that dream felt increasingly risky. Then the most alarming revelation emerged. Sensors placed beneath the lake walkway showed that the foundations had shifted more than initially reported. The storm hadn't just stressed the structure, it had begun to pull it apart. If another storm struck with equal or greater force, the walkway supports might fail entirely. It was no longer a question of aesthetics or ideals. It was a question of survival. Yet hope did not break. It surfaced quietly from an unexpected angle. A material specialist studying the fractured panels noticed something unusual. The cracks followed a symmetrical pattern, not the chaotic web typical of impact stress. The panels had flexed in harmony with the storm's oscillations. They had not failed because they were too weak, but because they had no way to release the force they absorbed. This insight changed everything. The glass didn't need to resist the storm. It needed to move with it, to sway, to distribute pressure, to breathe with the wind the same way trees do in a gale. To pursue this idea meant abandoning a core assumption that a solid, beautiful structure must remain still. Instead, the palace would need to become dynamic, responsive, alive. It was a bold direction, a frightening one, but it carried a truth the team could no longer ignore. If the palace of glass hoped to endure, it could not remain a fragile reflection. It would need to transform into a sanctuary shaped by the storms themselves, a place that blurred not only into the horizon, but into the rhythm of the land. And with that realization, the emotional buildup reached its peak. The creators now stood before the most difficult decision of the entire project: to preserve the dream they cherished, or let the storm reshape it entirely. The breakthrough arrived only when the team surrendered the illusion of perfection. The Palace of Glass could no longer be a rigid monument to stillness, not on a lake shaped by storms, wind, and ancient currents. To survive, it needed to become something else entirely, a structure that bent, flexed, and breathed with the land. The transformation began with the glass itself. New panels were crafted with micro-layered channels that allowed controlled expansion and contraction. Instead of resisting pressure, the glass could now disperse it in fluid waves, mirroring the movement of the lake beneath it. Each panel behaved like a living skin, shimmering with strength rather than fragility. The frames followed. Engineers replaced static joints with kinetic ones, subtle hinges disguised within the design, allowing the structure to sway just enough to relieve stress during storms. The palace no longer stood as a brittle monument against nature. It moved with it. And then came the most daring innovation, the floating walkway. Instead of anchoring it rigidly to the lake bed, the team introduced a buoyant, flexible foundation inspired by traditional northern fishing structures. With each shift in the water, the walkway adjusted, rising and falling with effortless grace. It was no longer a weak point in the design. It became the soul of it. The climax unfolded during the next storm. Winds rose. Waves pressed beneath the ice. The sky churned in dark spirals. The team gathered at the shore, breath tight, waiting for the test that would determine the palace's fate. When the storm struck, the palace responded in a way none of them had seen before. The glass panels bowed subtly with the wind, absorbing the force like sails catching breath. The frames flexed, releasing tension in quiet ripples. The walkway lifted with the storm's rhythm, rising just enough to dissipate the pressure beneath it. Light fractured across the surfaces, not in panic, but in harmony, dancing with the storm instead of breaking under it. Hours passed. The storm calmed, and when the sun returned, it revealed a palace untouched by damage, standing quietly as if acknowledging that it had finally learned the language of the land. Emotion swept through the team, relief, awe, and a deep sense of gratitude. They had not conquered the landscape. They had listened to it, let it shape them, allowed it to teach them how to build something that could truly belong here. Visitors later described the palace as a dream suspended above water, a place where storms became part of the beauty rather than a threat. They spoke of watching the structure shimmer with the wind, of feeling the lake's quiet power through transparent floors, of witnessing a building that behaved like a living creature rather than a static monument. And that is the legacy of the Palace of Glass. A reminder that fragility is not weakness, that transparency can be strength, and that the world reveals its deepest truths only when we are willing to change with it. Subscribe to join the journey.